symposiums, and we are greatly honored for your continued support. We thank you for attending this session and for being with us for all of this important work on reconciliation. We especially honor the ancestors of Greenwood and the Native Americans of this area and state, along with the spirit of harmony that connects all of us as a community. And at this time, I'd also like to thank our sponsors. Without them, these activities, this event, these sessions, this symposium would not be possible. Our national symposium sponsors are Griffin Communications, George Kaiser Family Foundation, and Oklahoma State University, Tulsa. Our symposium keynote sponsors are the Schusterman Foundation, along with the Ann and Henry Zarrow Foundation and the Maxine and Zarrow Foundation and the University of Tulsa, along with our friend Bert Holmes. Our program supporters are Sharna and Irwin Frank Foundation and Christy and John Gibson and A.R. Clinton, along with Frederick Dorward Law Firm and One Oak. Presenting sponsor, Tulsa Community College, Lobeck Taylor Foundation, the Tulsa Race Riot Massacre Commission, the Mental Health Association of Oklahoma, Magellan, our Oklahoma Arts and Humanities Council, and our session sponsors and supporters are Sam and Rita Combs and Comstar Advisors, the Williams Company, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also serve as our friend of the symposium, along with Ed Gray, Monica Basso, Commissioner Karen Keith, Mr. and Mrs. Michael T. Payton. So let's thank them all and give them a hand. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to my good friend Mark Davis to discuss why we are here. Mark?
All right. Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate that. So I'm so honored to be present here this evening. As was stated, my name is Mark Davis. I'm currently the Chief Programs Officer for the Mental Health Association Oklahoma. I'm here this evening to share a few reasons why we've all come together as collective organizations to learn about reconciliation, and equally important, to support the tremendous work that's taking place in this space. First, we're all one community. Our health, our success, our histories are intertwined. We must seek out the best for every person and collaborate to create strength through collective efforts. This year, our efforts to bring Dr. Cornel West to Tulsa to speak on reconciliation and the work that we should be doing is incredibly important to the Mental Health Association Oklahoma. It's without question, Dr. West will deliver us the prophetic fire that will undoubtedly advance us all forward, only to embolden us to do better and more fully understand how our collective efforts can make lasting systemic change. So in turn, we are all here to be the very model of how engaged, committed communities and groups can make all the difference in the journey of manifesting a greater tomorrow. We are all here this evening because the 100 years later requires reflection of the past failures and successes, but with a healthy dose of truth. That said, we must maintain a sober recognition that our efforts continuously remain intentional and in long term. We are here because 100 years later requires that we make plans for how we will learn from our past, repair the wrongs, and commit to actions and collaborations that propel us to a future that will make the world a better place for our children, our grandchildren, and the future generations, north, south, east, and west, of every race, of every culture, and the divide that has kept us apart. We are here this evening because our voices are all that we have. Our truth is all that we have. Our fight is all that we have. And while leaning in and embracing one another with a heart full of love, we'll continue to elevate each other yet through another 100 years. Thank you all for having me this evening. It's truly been an honor. And now I'll turn my time over to Mr. John W. Franklin, the moderator for this evening's session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark Davis. Thank you for your support. I'm very pleased to share with you this evening that our speaker is Cornel West. We've seen each other over the years in different places. And welcome, Cornel.
Oh, what a blessing it is for me. Anytime I get a chance to set eyes on you and build on the rich legacy of the one and only John Hope Franklin himself. But Buck Colbert Franklin too, as well as Molly and Aurelia. All of part of a grand nobility coming out of Oklahoma, my brother.
First, let me present my condolences to you on your recent loss of your mother. My wife and I
appreciate that.
My wife and I lost our mothers a month apart. And we know what that takes out of you and what it takes to keep going. I just encourage you to continue to be inspired by her and her love as you go forward.
No, I deeply appreciate that. I think that it's downright providential that this would be the first presentation I get a chance to give since we put precious mama in the grave for her bounce back, for her own home going. You know, she was married right in Paradise Baptist Church on the chocolate side of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1949 to my father, Clifton Lincoln West Jr., the son of Reverend C.L. West of the great Metropolitan Baptist Church. My dear brother Ray Owens, now one of the great leaders, not just in Tulsa, but in the nation. But it's a homecoming for me to be here. I'm a native son of Tulsa, Oklahoma, born in Moton Hospital. You remember Moton Hospital, brother?
I know about it. I don't remember it, but I know about it, and I know its current CEO, and it continues to try to give health to our community in North Tulsa. What are your earliest memories of Tulsa?
You know, my brother, that I was blessed to return every summer, that we would get a chance to see Brother Stanley and Brother Sparky and Brother Terry and Brother Michael. Those were my cousins. Aunt Tiny, Dorothy West, Uncle Earl West. We all get together, Lovey old Gwen, and at her house there in Northeast Tulsa. And we would, of course, go to Metropolitan Baptist Church to hear Granddad preach. And I remember the joy, I remember the food, and I remember the sports. We played a whole lot of sports because, you know, I was going to be the next Willie Mays as well as James Brown. So we had the music and we had the sports together there in Tulsa. We would actually go to Orange, Texas first, which is where my mother grew up. And then we see Big Daddy and Aunt Pang and Aunt Lily and everybody. Then we drive up to Tulsa and spend 2 or 3 weeks having such a good time there in Tulsa. Then we drive all the way back to Sunshine Land, California, man, with smiles on our faces, memories of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've always been unapologetic in blessed for being from Tulsa, Oklahoma, even though I didn't get a chance to spend that much time there after being born in Moton Hospital.
Well, my grandfather Buck Colbert came to visit me as soon as I was born in DC. And then my first trip to Tulsa was when I was 2. And my father would come every year. He'd particularly come when his father was still living. His father lived till 1960. So I got to know my grandfather from the age of from 0 to 8. And
Wow.
we would see him. We would see him in Tulsa. And at the time I would see him, he was living with my father's oldest sister, Mozella, who was a school teacher, second grade teacher at Dunbar for 30 years.
Oh, historic Dunbar, yes.
And then she married Waldo Jones Sr. from Muskogee, and he and my grandfather practiced law together. So it was Franklin and Jones until my grandfather passed. And then my uncle and his son practiced law together. So it was 3 generations of first Franklin and Jones, and then Jones and Jones. I was just...
But what a history, you have, though, brother. Let me ask you a question. Why do you think it is that Oklahoma could produce the greatest historian of America that was looking at the history through the eyes of the doings and sufferings of Black people? Your father, John Hope Franklin. It would produce Ralph Waldo Ellison from Oklahoma City, who was certainly the greatest American novelist of male persuasion in the last 40 years. I think Toni Morrison would give him a run for his money, but certainly on the male side. And then you got Charles Christian, too, who's probably the greatest improvisational jazz musician on the guitar from Oklahoma City. We haven't even got to Alfred Woodard yet. What is it about Oklahoma that keeps dishing out these towering figures, man?
Well, I know that my father was inspired by his mother, who was a school teacher, Molly Parker. And during the time between when my grandfather moved to Tulsa in February 21 and the time the families reunited in 1925, my father really depended on his mother for being both parents. She taught him how to fish, for example.
Ooh.
And it's only after 1924 that their family was able to move to Tulsa. They had planned to move in June of 21. And Grandpa had come to Tulsa to prepare a way for them and had left them behind in Brennisville outside of Muskogee. But shortly after he got here, got established his law firm with O.H. Chappelle and I.H. Spears, the community that he had seen, visited, and moved to was utterly destroyed. And he writes about it. He has a major role in fighting the city ordinance and encouraging this devastated community to rebuild with whatever they had. And that's quite a long battle.
That went all the way to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, where your father fought that through on behalf of justice, on behalf of Black people.
When Dad left Oklahoma to go to Fisk, where he met my mother, his goal was to return to Tulsa and become a lawyer and help his father out of poverty. Because as far as he was concerned, his father was a brilliant lawyer, but wasn't making enough money for the family to really thrive. So he was going to come back and become an attorney. It's funny, he eventually did teach law. He taught constitutional history at Duke for 7 years. But he fell in love with history through his major professor at Fisk, Theodore Currier, a man from Maine. And Uncle Ted, as I called him, prepared Dad for Harvard, for graduate school. And he had a thirst for knowledge, a love of history. And then, he just went on to research and produce and research and produce. I was talking about
32 years old, old brother. He writes the classic From Slavery to Freedom. 32 years old, 1947.
I know.
People forget how young he was to reshape the whole framework and paradigm for us to understand deep truths about how this country came to be, rooted in the vicious attacks on indigenous brothers and sisters of all the various tribes. And I know that you got some indigenous blood shot through your own history and your own veins in that way. Many of us do. We're all hybrids in that sense. But also, I think what is distinctive about your father is a wonderful line on page 44 of Carter G. Woodson's great The Miseducation of the Negro, where he says, highly educated Negroes must fall in love with their people, which is another way of saying must fall in love with those Sly Stone called everyday people, or those James Cleveland called ordinary people, which means that you use the highest level of intellectual excellence with a humility and a willingness to serve. That's John Hope Franklin. That's the brother I know. Yes. I remember walking with him around Lake Como in Italy in 1990 when one of the great prophetic figures, Marion Wright Edelman, brought us all together, trying to come up with ways in which we could fight for freedom. And the thing that hits me more than anything else is how he preserved his for realness. He never pretentious, never arrogant, never condescending. You know, so often intellectuals are associated with arrogance. That was not John Hope Franklin. That he was always willing to engage in kenosis, the emptying of himself, the giving of himself, the sacrificing of himself. I know that had something to do with Buck Colbert. It's got something to do with Molly. It's got something to do with your blessed mother, Aurelia, because it was so much of a duo and a pair and a couple. He talked about her all the time, walking around that lake with me. And one of the points he made was even the great Du Bois himself, he said, still had a little bit too much arrogance, still had a little bit too much detachment from ordinary folk. He said, Brother West, we all acknowledge his genius, but I decided to be different. I say, Brother Franklin, I am just like you. I come out of Shiloh Baptist Church. I learned that if the kingdom of God is within me, then everywhere I go, I ought to leave a little heaven behind. And you're leaving heaven behind in the face of the hounds of hell. What are the hounds of hell? They're hatred. They are greed. They are envy. They are arrogance. They are hypocrisy. And they're tied to structures of domination like vicious legacies of white supremacy, vicious legacy of predatory capitalism, vicious legacy of imperial expansion. Those are the hounds of hell with which all of us must contend. They are inside of us as well as inside of our institutions. And I think one of the reasons why he had such spiritual maturity, and the benchmark of spiritual maturity is always a courageous tenacity inseparable from a genuine humility. And I think one of the reasons he had that was that he saw it every day in Buck Colbert, in Molly. Now, how is it your father's going to be broke as the Ten Commandments financially when he's giving everything as the amazing Buck Franklin? That's what he was known as. What did everyday people mean when they said amazing Buck Franklin? Namely, you see that brother right there? He got one of the most sophisticated minds. He's got the highest level of skills. He is using them in service to leave a little heaven behind. What is that? He's following the 25th chapter of Matthew. What you do unto me, you do unto the least of these. He's following the genius of Hebrew scripture, that hesed, that loving kindness, that steadfast love to the orphan, to the widow, to the fatherless, the motherless, the subjugated, the persecuted, no matter what color they are. But you begin on your side of town with your mama, your own daddy, your own grandparents, and that includes for them in your family, Black folk and indigenous folk. Now, see, my folk from Louisiana who made their way up to Oklahoma. So I think I've got a little less of that precious blood from the indigenous brothers and sisters, and I got just more Negroosity. You know what I mean?
Well, the two things I want to say about that, then I'll let you take it. One of the things I think that he talked about when he was working on From Slavery to Freedom, and he wrote it in a relatively short period of time, like 2 years, he uncovered so much information about our past. He learned about the depths of the slave trade, the attacks on our women, the attacks on communities, the distribution of Africans throughout the hemisphere, not just the United States, but Brazil, the Caribbean, all the countries in the hemisphere. He said in doing that work, in doing that research, he lost his innocence. All of that material is in the archives, in the libraries, but to absorb it all at one time was really a bit much. And the second thing, I find myself following in his footsteps, because particularly in New York, he was asked to be guest preacher in all kinds of African-American denominations, from the real quiet churches to the churches with the nurses in the eye. And he took me along with him. And so we now call that public history. But that's an example of him not limiting himself to the ivory tower, to go among ordinary people and share that knowledge. You remember when Black bookstores popped up all over the country in the 60s. It wasn't the highbrow intellectuals going to those bookstores. And Dad went to many a book signing for his books and other people's books. And people were just steeped in our information. And one of the most interesting lectures he said he gave was in a maximum security prison. A chapter of the NAACP, a group of brothers who'd read all of his works in prison, invited him to come to prison to talk to them. And I find myself speaking in mosques, in temples, in
recording in progress.
And people hosted him around the country and around the world. Any day of the week, it may be you coming to dinner one night and someone from India coming to dinner the next night, and someone that he had just met at the University of Chicago or Brooklyn College, bringing them home to dinner. So our home had just a range of interesting people. And when the phone rang, it could be Thurgood, it could be Mrs. King, it could be anybody on the other end of the phone. And you had to know how to engage them, to talk with them.
Well, we were talking about the Precious Mann family, and Emily Mann at Princeton, and her father being so welcoming with your father and mother and yourself when your father was made chairman of the history department at Brooklyn College, the first time that a Black person was ever chairman of a history department in a predominantly white institution. And the deep, deep love and the deep, deep solidarity and conviviality between the Manns and the Franklins have always been paradigmatic for many. And there, of course, you got both a Black family and Jewish family accenting the best of what it is to have families of any kind, what it is to have friendships of any kind. Well, you see, John O. Franklin, he was that kind of brother. Your mother, she that kind of sister. You yourself, I want to salute you for a moment, because you got your own voice. We come from a people that lift every voice, and you're not just an echo of Aurelia and John O. No, John Whittington Franklin, that W, you got your own twist, your own way of engaging these, and you've had a magnificent career. But I think you and I would agree, though, brother, that when you think of 100 years ago at Tulsa and the vicious attacks and assaults, the massacres, what our Jewish brothers and sisters would call pogroms. You think of Kitchener's 1903 in Russia, or even our precious Palestinian brothers and sisters would call it Nakba, the catastrophe. And I think one of the points your father was making was there has never been a Black problem, a Negro problem in America. There have been catastrophes visited on Black people that have been denied by the mainstream, denied by the establishment, denied by the paradigms in the academy that refuse to tell the truth. And the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. And if you're not allowing suffering to speak, there's a good chance that you're just putting forward another version of the lie that rationalizes the structures and institutions that perpetuate the suffering. And he started on the Black side of town because there's no way that we Black people can love anybody if we don't love ourselves. I'm a serious Jesus loving free black man, which means that you love your neighbor as yourself. And your neighbor's anybody. It could be the Ethiopian, Guatemalan, it could be indigenous folk, it could be the Creek Nation, it could be the Brazilian people, it could be in South Africa, it could be our precious white brothers and sisters in Appalachia, it could be our Asian brothers and sisters, whatever. Jesus loves the little children, all of the children of the world, red and yellow, black or white, they are precious in his sight. That's my kind of fundamentalist Christianity that flies in the grain of so many of my white evangelical Christians, who's so selective, so narrow, so truncated, so parochial, so provincial in their love. And you and I know that we come from a people who for 400 years have been chronically hated. That's what you saw in Tulsa 1921. It was the equivalent of a war. It was a vicious form of contempt. 1,200 families, 191 businesses, hundreds and hundreds of black folk, 6,000 under detainment, others thousands pushed out, forced to leave the city. And in the face of that kind of institutionalized hatred and personal contempt, and that's not just the only one, there's hundreds of them. Elaine, Arkansas, 1919, and 27 others. There's East St. Louis in 1917. There's massacres in Atlanta in 1907 and Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. We can go all the way up to Brother George Floyd Jr. in Minneapolis. But what has been the best response of black people after 400 years of that kind of hatred? Here come the love warriors. Loving truth, loving beauty, loving goodness, choosing to be wounded healers rather than wounded hurters, or like Louis Armstrong, joy spreaders rather than sorrow peddlers. How is it that these people, great people, world historical people, disproportionately shaping the culture of the world in light of all of this hatred coming at us, is not a function of skin pigmentation, I can tell you that. It's got something to do with spirit. It's got something to do with choices made. It's got something to do with visions put forward. It's got something to do with courage enacted. It's got something to do with tenacity, stamina, endurance, determination. These are fundamental commitments and convictions. That has been the history of the best of black folk. Now, granted, we all have histories of black thugs and black gangsters. I got a whole lot of gangster in me. I was a gangster before I met Jesus. I'm just a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities right now. But something always holds the reins. The memories of Irene B. West, Clifton B. West, Reverend C.L. West, Lovey O'Gwen, Nick Byers, John Hope Franklin, Aurelia, Buck Colbert, Molly, John W. Frank. We can go on and on. We can go on and on. It could be our precious sister Fletcher, Viola Fletcher, speaking with such grace and dignity before the Congressional Committee. And yet in her eyes and in her language, you still see she is on what the Isley brothers would call the caravan of love. She's on the love train. And that love train is a justice train, because justice is what love looks like in public. But any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. We're not just on a justice train, because you need something deeper than justice. And love is inseparable from justice, but it's more profound than justice, because it's driven by a deep care, a deep concern, a willingness to give it all. That's what is distinctive feature of black people in the face of all of this terrorism. 1619 and before, up to this very day, in the face of that terrorism, what has been the response? Ida B. Wells, what you got to say? Do you want to terrorize folk back? No, I want freedom for everybody, but I'm going to tell the truth. I'm not going to deny there's terrorism coming at me. Frederick Douglass, what you got to say in face of the terrorism? I want liberty for everybody, but I'm not going to deny this white supremacist barbaric slavery coming at me and my loved ones that is spoiling the souls even of the slaveholders and crushing the possibilities of life chances of so many of my black brothers and sisters. And I want to be in solidarity with my indigenous brothers and sisters. I'm going to be in solidarity with my white brothers and sisters who are willing to fight against the white supremacist grain, like a John Brown, or like a Ann Braden, or like a Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, or like a Dorothy Day. We can go on and on and on. We all know vanilla brothers and sisters who struggle against white supremacy and have very difficult Thanksgiving dinners with their families because many of their families haven't got that memo yet. They still tied into white supremacist modes of being in the world. They still got too much coldness and callousness when it comes to black people and brown people and indigenous people. So this is always a moral and spiritual battle with immense political consequences. And part of the greatness, I mean, one of the moments that always struck me about your father, though, man, when he stood up for Du Bois. And when he stood up, and this was a moment when most of the Cold War black liberals, which was main black leadership, wouldn't touch Du Bois with a 10-foot pole. Just like they wouldn't touch Paul Robeson with a 10-foot pole. And when they asked all of the black scholars, please come and celebrate Du Bois, most of them stayed away. Your father stepped forward and said, I'll be MC for him. I got a critique of his communism. I got a critique of his relation to the Soviet Union, but he is my brother in his quest for truth, and all of us have blind spots in our quest for truth. But what cannot be denied is like the Wilson brothers of the Gap Band with Greenwood, Archer, and Pine in their music. Say what they mean what they say. They sing from their heart and their souls. So it was with Du Bois, so it was with John Hope Franklin. We disagree, but I'm saying what I mean, W.E.B., and you saying what you mean. We're not faking this. There's no posing and posturing. This ain't phony. We ain't playing some game. This is not about our career or our status. There's folk out here who are suffering, and we trying to understand it. I'm going to be the MC. I'm going to invite the folk to Carnegie Hall. And how many of them really showed up? You know the story even better than I do. Ooh, they so scared, intimidated, walking around like they so sophisticated and still nigger. Less than, and to walk around so scared and intimidated. You're laughing when it ain't funny. You're scratching when it don't itch. You're always wearing the mask just for your career rather than something deeper. Obsessed with your brand and forget about what your cause is. This is part of our problem these days, my brother. Everybody got a brand. Not enough folk got a cause. If all you got is a brand, you can be bought off in a minute. Everybody's for sale, just like everything is for sale. Wholesale commodification, wholesale commercialization. Oh, how spiritually empty. Oh, can you imagine what our grandparents would say? Everybody walk around like a peacock. Peacocks strut because they can't fly. Last thing we want is simply folk walking around. I'm the first black this. I'm the second black this. I'm the third black this. Look at me. Look at me. I'm so smart. I'm so rich. I got so much money. You ain't nothing but a peacock if you're not willing to serve, cut against the grain. So John Hope Franklin went to that gathering. Martin Luther King went too. Many of folk on his staff, you might remember, told him, Brother Martin, you don't want to go to that gathering and be associated with W.E.B. Du Bois? That's the last thing you need. No. Why? Because we remember Tulsa 1921. We remember Elang, Arkansas 1919. All of the different vicious attacks, and we will never allow those attacks to have the last word in terms of defining who we are. And when we define who we are, it's going to be like a jazz orchestra. It ain't going to be a military band. And the jazz orchestra about what? It's a collection of independent voices. It's not some main conductor who dictates from above. So of course we're going to have disagreement. That's what it's about. It's about a cacophony of heterogeneous voices. That's what John Hope Franklin understood. That's what we loved about him. Because when you're so for real and you're so honest and you're so candid that you don't mind taking a chance and going to the edge of the abyss. You don't mind folk viewing you in such a way that all you're concerned about is trying to get over or being obsessed with the 11th commandment, really, which is about thou shalt not get caught as thou attempt to get over by any means. This has been a dominant norm among too many of our black middle class folk. They have lost connection with our precious Jamal and precious Letitia in the hood. They are so obsessed with the white gaze that allows them to move up in their careers. They've lost senses of their calling, of their vocation as dimensions of time, my brother. The past, the present, and the future. Tulsa's past, Tulsa's present, Tulsa's future. America's past, America's present, America's future. And of course, we're intertwined with the world. America's the largest empire in the world. 800 military bases around the world. Another 3,000 at home. That's one reason why we can't deal with these issues of poverty and education and health care for everybody, because so much of our money goes to the military. 53 cents of every dollar goes to the military. And then at the same time, folk who are obsessed with just trying to be accepted by a narrow status quo rather than understanding the larger context under which that status quo came into being, and making sure that in understanding that status quo, you are trying to keep track of the least of these. This is what I like about Brother William Barber and the others with the Poor People's Campaign. That's part of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. That's part of the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer. That's part of the legacy of Ella Baker and Marion Wright Edelman. When we look at the Black community, we must never look at the Black community first and foremost through the lens of those who are doing well. They're doing well because of the struggles of people who created opportunities for them. We must always look at the Black community or any nation through the lens of the least of these. Those in the prison. I've been blessed to teach in prison for 41 years now. When I first started teaching, 250,000 incarcerated. Now they got 2 million. I've seen the transition. I've seen the transformation. We got to keep track of our precious brothers and sisters in the hood, in the barrios, on the reservations, white, poor, in Appalachia and other places. And in trying to do that, you will always get in what Brother John Lewis called good trouble. Good trouble. And that's an echo of that powerful wade in the water that comes out of our ancestors. Wade in the water, wade in the water. God gonna trouble the water. And that's an echo of minor prophet Nahum. God has God's way in the whirlwind and the storm. That's what Marcus Garvey said. I'm coming back in the whirlwind. Why? Because the whirlwind and the storm have the capacity to test our souls and allow us to see things more clearly. Like the pandemic, we can see America for what America is. Like Black Lives Matter, with all these excessive police murders and brutality, you can see America for what it is, not because America is solely its worst, but America will never be at its best if it does not confront its worst. That's why Black people are blues people. And the blues is always on intimate terms with catastrophe. Ralph Ellison himself, fellow Oklahoman, used to say, the blues ain't nothing but a personal narrative of catastrophe lyrically expressed. Nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. That's the king of the blues. That's B.B. King. That's catastrophic. Nobody loves you. You thought your mama did, and she might be jiving. That's deeper than Antigone's Sophocles put forward. You have nothing to fall back on. What you gonna do, BB? I'm going to fall back on my memories of Robert Johnson and Delta playing his guitar. I'm going to fall back on the tradition. I'm going to fall back on the best moments with my mama. Even in the worst moments with my mama might begin to triumph at times. There's a style and a smile and a piety. And the great Rabbi Heschel understood piety as remembrance, reverence, and resilience and resistance all at the same time. That's piety. That's Sankofa in the Black nationalist tradition. You refuse to move forward until you connect with the best of those who came before. Why? Because when catastrophe comes to your house, when your mama does die, when your father does die, when your friend does betray you, you're going to have to fall back on something. And it's going to be the best of your ROOTS so that your ROUTES can continue in the best way toward truth and goodness and beauty. So in this particular moment, what do we see? Overwhelming spiritual decay, moral decrepitude, across the board, increasing oppression, increasing lies and crimes, increasing assaults and attacks, microaggressions and physical ones. And we should note, we have to be very honest about this, outright brute force from vigilante activity, police activity, and we haven't even got to the AFRICOM on the African continent. We haven't even got to the drones being dropped. We haven't even got to the various ways in which the American empire is coexisting or supporting other nations who are dropping bombs on other people. And I think in the end, I won't go on and on, though, brother. You cut me off whenever you want to, brother, because I want to make sure we got time for question and answer. But I do want to make this point that Oklahoma, which was the state that disproportionately supported Eugene Debs as a Democratic Socialist in 1912, there were more Democratic Socialists in Oklahoma than any other state per capita at that time. Oklahoma, the place where there was an attempt to create an all black and red state to try to get some distance from barbaric white supremacist Jim Crow and other southern states. Oklahoma's history has been completely whitewashed, denied, evaded, avoided. Why? Because once that oil came in, oh, lo and behold, woo, now we view life like a gold rush. And when you view life like a gold rush, you're going to end up worshiping the golden calf. And you're going to transform the golden rule to not do unto others as you would have others to do unto you. But it's going to be whoever got the gold makes the rules. It's going to be gangster-like. It's going to be thuggish-like. You're going to try to shape the whole state and the whole nation and even the world in your image. I'm thinking of my dear brother Joshua Goshen here in Tulsa. And look at his attempt to move to the highest levels with all the robber barons of the world. Millions and millions of dollars, bought a railroad, $200,000 way back in his day. Oh, pride goeth before a fall, though, doesn't it? He had his catastrophe. God bless him. I try to love everybody. I'm a Christian, but I'm going to tell the truth about gangster behavior, including my own. And every group is capable of gangster behavior. Black, white, red, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, atheistic, communist, capitalist, across the board. That is part of tradition so great and so world historical. And by world historical, I'm using Hegel's language here. And by world historical, what Hegel meant was by particular peoples who are able to enact certain kinds of visions and virtues so that they disproportionately influence and shape the world. That's why hip hop is the lingua franca of all young people in every corner of the globe, because it is but a particular moment of the Black musical tradition. And the Black musical tradition is the greatest modern tradition of spiritual fortitude and artistic creativity. We might not have control over land or territory. We might not have rights. We might not have capacity to be respected by the white mainstream, but our humanity will in fact overflow, and our genius and talent will be manifest in a variety of different ways, including our sonic expressions with our sonic honor and our sonic confidence. And that's one of the reasons why we fall back on a Charlie Christian and an Alfred Woodard as much as we do in Ellis, because the musicians are not just entertainers. There's an attempt to reduce them to entertainers so that they become simply persons who stimulate and titillate the mainstream as the mainstream wrestles with its own spiritual decay. But we know that our musicians at their deep. Stevie Wonder's Love and the Need of Love. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. Aretha Franklin singing Respect, written by a genius from making Georgia named Otis Redding. We can go on and on. We ain't got to the dramatics of the Delphonics yet. Meaning what? That they are reminded your ship, our wounded healing practices, our freedom fighting, and our freedom fighting is not just political, it is spiritual, it's moral, it's ethical. And even if we are crushed, what does Sterling Brown remind us in Southern Road generation? Anyway, remembering those who were crushed, remembering those who were crucified, remembering those who were lied on and criminalized and so forth and so on, that we're not looking at ourselves through any white normative gaze to get some kind of approval from a white establishment so we feel good about ourselves to be the next peacock. No, that's truncated worldly success. We looking for something deeper, spiritual greatness, moral greatness. What William James called a habitual vision of greatness. And greatness is what? It's not Alexander the Great. It's not Napoleon. It's not Genghis Khan. No, not at all. No, he or she is greatest among you would be your servant. Somewhere I read that he or she, the greatest among you, will have a scope of love, of truth and beauty and goodness, will be willing to live a life embodying, enacting that, not in the spirit of self-righteousness, because all of us fall short, but a spirit of self-criticism, the Socratic dimension. Unexamined life is not worth living. The uncommitted life is also not worth living. Yes, our neighbors have crooked hearts. We got crooked hearts too. How do we attempt to love our neighbors, our crooked neighbors, with our crooked hearts? That's what some of us learn in vacation Bible school. That's what makes the John Hope Franklins and the Aretha Franklins and the C.L. Franklins a spiritual and moral nobility. And a spiritual and moral noble person is simply a sinner who looks at the world through the lens of a self-critical quest for truth and goodness and beauty. And for a Christian like me, I add the holy too. But I know folk who are holy ain't got no monopoly on truth and beauty and goodness, because we got some gangsters in our churches, gangsters in our synagogues, gangsters in our mosques, gangsters in our temples, just like we got some gangsters in Congress, and gangsters on the Supreme Court, and gangsters at Harvard, and at Yale, and at Princeton. What is a gangster? A gangster is someone who is driven by a coldness, a callousness, an obsession with themselves, a narcissism in which they cannot see broad enough, they can't feel deeply enough, and most of them can't act courageously because they're too scared and cowardly and concerned about their careers rather than their callings. That is what we learn from those Black folk who didn't just survive, but thrive after 1921. And the Black folk who didn't make it, who went to their graves, unknown graves, mass graves, that somebody will always remember their love witness in a family, touched by their service. It may not be written up in a textbook, at least not till John Hope Franklin gets there, because he's going to unveil it. Or Sister Sadia Hartman's going to unveil it. Oh, we got a long tradition of these high-quality storytellers and historians and analytic narrativists who say, you know, we going to tell the story. Yeah, we're going to tell the story about the Chickasaw Nation, too. Yes, we are. We're going to tell the story about the white working class folk who fought against white supremacy. We're going to tell the story about the Jewish brothers and sisters. I know my dear brother Nathan Levitt, who I was blessed to have a student. He's in the White House right now. I pray for him all the time. He's a wonderful brother. His magnificent father, Ken, right here in Tulsa, went to the same high school that my father went to, Booker T, Washington. Yes, indeed. We're going to tell a story about all of those who are willing to hold up that blood-stained, tear-soaked banner. Blood-stained and tear-soaked. But the blood and the tears do not have the last word. It's just like Good Friday. And that Good Friday murder, 2012, right here in Tulsa. Here come the hounds of hell again. Here comes some more hatred. Here comes some more greed. Here comes some more contempt. Here comes some more envy. Here comes some more resentment. Here comes some more white supremacy. What you gonna do? Never be thoroughly surprised by evil. We are blues people. Strange fruit is everywhere. Is that right, Billie Holiday from Baltimore City? Yes, it is, Brother West. Strange fruit is all over. Is that true, Maripol, the Jewish brother who wrote the lyrics? Yes, it is, Brother West. Don't be surprised by that strange fruit. Those black bodies hanging from the trees. Those black bodies laying there on the street, tarred and feathered, burnt. No, that becomes a moment for intense fortification, not just being woke. I tell my young brothers and sisters all the time, I like your talk about waking from sleepwalking, but if you woke all the time, you're going to suffer from insomnia. You got to fortify yourself. You got to take a nap sometime. You got to know when to sleep. So when you bounce back is stronger than ever. So when your mama dies and your tears flow, that in the end, part of her afterlife is in your life. So you become even more fortified than ever, even without her, because you're building on something so precious. So your wokeness is just a moment in your putting on the whole armor, the 6th chapter of Ephesians. So you're putting on the whole fortification to be able to be, in the language of John Coltrane, a force for good. A long distance runner, just like Brother John W. here. He's looking young, but he's been around for a while. He's a long distance runner like his father, his mother, his grandfather, and his grandmother. And sometimes you don't live that long. Right? Martin's gone at 39, so was Malcolm. Charlie Parker's gone in his mid-30s. Coltrane's dead at 40. Sometimes you don't live that long. But your life itself is a gift. And you cultivate the gifts that you have in order to give it back. And then you give your life back as a gift to something bigger than you. Rabbi Heschel used to always say, something greater than us is summoning us, calling us to be of service to something bigger than us. That's what we learned from Tulsa 1921. On the white side of town, how much courage do you have? What kind of sacrifices are you willing to make? Is there something bigger than you that's calling you in order to stay in contact with the humanity of your fellow human beings who are beautifully black and human? On the black side of town, are you actually being called by something bigger than you? So it's not just a matter of your self-interest. It's not even just a matter of your group interest, but it's yourself and your group in a universal vision that embraces all of those francs fanon called the wretched of the earth in every continent on the globe. Yes. Thank God that we come back to commemorate that war, that massacre, that pogrom. Not a riot. Oh, no, I don't accept that kind of deodorized, sanitized language. We got to keep it funky. So we learned from Bootsy Collins and George Clinton and James Brown and Betty Davis, funk master herself. When you keep it funky, the funk is always real. You're not faking nothing at all. And when you keep it funky, you're dealing with what Samuel Beckett called the mess. And the mess in space and time is always all of our fears and anxieties and insecurities leading us to somehow want to rationalize our limitations rather than expand who and what we can be, to shatter our limitations. Yes, that is a fundamental lesson of Tulsa. 1921, May 3-1, June the 1st. Now I hear that our dear president is on his way, and I applaud that. I appreciate that. I'm reminded that Warren G. Harding, June 1, 1921, 3 days after the massacre, 3 days after the pogrom, 3 days after the war. What did he have to say? As you can imagine, it was Pat Boone rather than Curtis Mayfield. Deodorized language, kumbaya language, sanitized language. We are one. We always overlook our differences. Spare me, Warren G. Harding. We were born at night, but not last night. You just reinforcing the denial. You're just reinforcing the invasion so that 100 years later, we still refuse to confront the vicious legacy of white supremacy. I say to my dear brother Joseph Biden, when you come to my beloved Tulsa, I hope you have some truths to tell. What kind of accountability is in place? What kind of reparations are in place? What kind of policies are in place to ensure that our precious poor and working class Black folk can live lives of decency? We don't need more deodorized language. We don't need pretty speeches that hide and conceal the suffering. I say the same thing to my dear sister Harris. People get upset with me. Oh, brother, well, she got to be real light on the Black sister now. You know, she's up there having a tough time. Oh, I love Sister Kamala Harris. She's my AKA sister. She's my Black sister. She's my fellow human being. But every human being and every politician, including ourselves, must be accountable, answerable, and responsible. So when I hear both Brother Biden and Sister Harris echoing Senator Tim Scott, America's not a racist country, I say they better get off the symbolic crack pipe. Get off of it. I know where you're going to come to Oklahoma. I know where you're going to come to Tulsa and talk about it's not a racist place. Of course it's racist. Is it less racist than it was in 1921? I think it is less racist, yes, because people have sacrificed. But just because it's less racist doesn't mean it's not racist. And you can't be involved in a PR relations, a public relations strategy and say, well, we can't really tell the truth because it's going to alienate this particular part of our population. And we're concerned about the 2022 election, and we're concerned about our 2024 election. That is precisely the kind of thinking that has locked Black poor people and working people into the bowels of the American empire for these many decades. Where's the truth telling from our politicians? You can do it in a nuanced way, but you don't have to evade and deny it. We shall see what Brother Biden's got to say. We'll see what his speechwriters got to say. Are you going to be true to the standards set by the John Hope Franklins? Are you going to be true to the standards set by the Charlie Christians and the Wilson brothers? It's not talking about politics only. We're talking about integrity, honesty, decency, courage, vision. That cuts much deeper than just politics. But it has strong political ramifications because it always embraces initially the plight and the predicament of those, in the language of Malcolm X, who are catching the most hell, who are the targets of the hounds of hell, the targets of that hatred and greed and resentment and contempt and hypocrisy. That's the kind of challenge we have to pose. to Brother Biden and Sister Harris, and I do it all in love because I really do believe that that love transcends skin color, and it transcends nation, it transcends gender, it transcends sexual orientation. Very, very much so. And it will always get you in some trouble. That's a good sign. That's a good sign.
Brother Cornel, I'm glad that you raised the whole discussion about Du Bois because Dad got to know Du Bois first when Dad was in graduate school in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And when they moved to New York in '56, they became much closer. And Dad was intent on spending time with W.E.B. Du Bois. That's when the FBI started following my dad. And Dad lived long enough to have access to his FBI files. And every time he went to a public or a small gathering with Du Bois, the FBI was there and tracking him. So it's when he turned 90 that he had access to his FBI files. Not all of us get to 90 to know that you have access to your FBI files.
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth?
And he refused to accept the U.S. Now, in 1963, 100 years after emancipation, Dad was asked to write a report for the government on the status of African Americans. Well, 1963, things were not really very good. We couldn't vote. We didn't have fair housing. None of those civil rights laws had been passed. And so we were a disenfranchised people. And so the people read his report and they said, well, can you make this a little bit more positive? They said, no, I can't do that because that's not where we are. And they scrapped his report because they wanted a positive report. They wanted a 100 years after history positive report.
Wow. Wow.
And so
I mean, it reminds me of the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce years ago when they really did some massacre, and they said, no, we tell this truth. This is going to be too difficult. We're going to suppress it. We're going to suppress. We're not going to tell the truth about what the Tulsa Tribune said when it said that Brother Dick Rowland was tearing at her clothes, was attacking her. Those were lies. We've seen how media lies can lead toward violence in 2021. It did in 1921 too. Those were lies. They were asking your father to lie. He said, no, I got integrity. Right. I'm from the best part of Oklahoma. I got integrity. I'm not going to do it. You know?
I'm not going to tell the happy story you want to be told.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Sister Vanessa, do we have any questions from either the audience or online?
I will check. I'll turn it over to the moderator.
This always makes me think of Black futurists. Our parents, our grandparents always imagined a better future for us as we must imagine a better future for generations coming after us.
That's exactly right.
Can you imagine during slavery, imagine better lives? Isabel Wilkerson was talking last night about how people were leaving the various places that were in the South for a better life and then encountering new challenges in the West, in the North. So I see we have someone with a microphone in the audience. Your question, please.
All right. John W., this is Dr. Pauline Harris here in Tulsa. And I have a question from America. He's from Kansas City.
All right, greetings. My name is America Patton. I'm here representing the Quindaro Underground Railroad and also the Rufus Harley Foundation. And also Dr. West, King Downing gives his regards to you, your colleague. And also,
Salute, salute.
you can meet Dr. Franklin's father when he came to Kansas City, and he signed his book, Married to America, when I brought a few students down there. But my question is in terms to you, Dr. West. I'm the son of the late, and he taught John Coltrane at bagpipes, and Rashad Roland Clark, yeah, and all of those other guys. And Sonny Rollins was his mentor. But he was very outspoken about the bagpipes and about the bagpipes going back to Africa and the origins of the bagpipes. And he faced a lot of, he would get the cops called on him all the time, and he would come to the door, and he would say, the cops say, we have a complaint that the bagpipes are being played. This is in North Philadelphia. He would say, this is in the middle of the Civil Rights era. And he would say, do I look like I'm Scottish or Irish to you? And they would just bow out and leave. But it got to a point where me and my sister, Noah Harmony, we've been working real hard to get the Rufus Hardy Foundation up and going. And I was hoping I brought a CD that I brought for you particularly because I know how you have advocated for jazz artists. And the CD I have here is called Keys of Justice, and this is a CD that I restored. And I wanted you to listen to this and hear my father because I worked for maybe about 3 years to help to preserve my father's voice. And this is him live at Clayton State University in 1998 and unedited with the Bill Anchel Trio. And the title of this is Keys of Justice. And of course, my father just passed in 2006. So what role do you see jazz in terms of reconciliation having going forward? And people like my father, who people don't often talk about, and the lack of understanding with people who are unorthodox or maybe have a different interpretation or who are maybe outspoken. Because my father was very philosophical. He did not hold back his opinions about different things, but he was a creative genius that many people are not holding a conversation for, and reconciliation. Do you see jazz being a part of that conversation in terms of Tulsa and the 100th-year anniversary, helping to bridge that stories and connecting them to indigenous cultures?
Ooh, appreciate those powerful, heartfelt words, my dear brother. And when I talked about the Black tradition at its best, driven by love warriors and freedom fighters and wounded healers and joy spreaders, that I believe that musicians in general, this is true for Beethoven, Mozart, this is true for Mendelssohn, this is true for Stephen Sondheim, this is true for Barbra Streisand, it's true for any culture. Musicians are the vanguard of the species because we as a species have to come to terms with our overwhelming suffering and grief. And we get some distance from our suffering and griefs, initially from silence and then moans and groans and shrieks and screams that then become transformed from noise into music and language itself. And rational discourse comes much later. And so when you talk about the history of any people and say nothing about their music, then you're going to completely miss out on the depths of their spirituality. And so for Black folks, especially given the fact that for over 200 some years, it was against the law for us to learn how to read and write. Well, we learned how to read each other. We learned how to write sonically. And it was against the law for us to find a home. That's why people tried to make Oklahoma. The great McCabe, E.P. McCabe, wanted Oklahoma and the others to be a home. And yet all these Black municipalities, Muskogee and others, are still around. You had over 50 of them. Now you got about, 13, 14? But there was an attempt to make a home. No, the only place we could find home was in the music, was in the arts. So our musicians exemplified the highest levels of love, freedom, healing, and joy. No one can live a life of moral and spiritual excellence without love, freedom, joy, and healing. No matter how unhealed you are, you've got to cultivate the arts of healing of self and others, of your children, your loved ones, your partners, your friends, and even strangers. Right back to Hebrews scripture again, right? You love the stranger over and over. Again, you see that in Hebrew scripture. You love your enemy. Oh, that's the Palestinian named Judah that I'm in love with, named Jesus. You love your enemies because they have the capacity to change, because they're made in the same image of God that you are. They just choose to want to crush you. And you got something that they have inside of you that must be crushed, or you will become as gangster-like as they are. And so in that sense, the musicians at their best, not just remind us of this, they enact it in their arts. Now, I think this is true for painters and architects. I don't want to confine the art simply to the musicians, but I think that music has a very, very special role to play. And for Black people, there's just no doubt. I mean, you know, you couldn't go into Toni Morrison's house. Brother Franklin would probably remind you, remember that, without hearing Sarah Vaughan. We know that James Baldwin wanted to write like Bessie Smith, right? That Ralph Ellison wanted to write like Louis Armstrong. Why? Not just because they were obsessed with music, but they knew they wanted to achieve the highest level of greatness and excellence in their genre, in their way of making sense of the world. And it has been the great musicians who exemplified the highest levels of the love and freedom and the joy and the courage that is required for anybody being, you know, worthy of a certain. He's one of the great ones, and of course, with the connection, I wish you. Radio show that I have with Trisha Rose was one of the most powerful conversations you ever want to hear, and it was mainly Sonny. It was on his 90th birthday, and he just opened up with his whole life, his relation to Coltrane, his relation to, I mean, all the great musicians, and his relation to your father. So, I mean, I salute you. My address is Union Theological Seminary, 3041 Broadway, New York, New York. And you just send your CD, my brother. Definitely 10027, 10027. Can't wait to get my hands on it.
We have a question from Antioch Baptist Church. Please unmute yourself. Will you please unmute yourself?
No, I appreciate that. And I give a salute to Antioch, just like I give a salute to Metropolitan Baptist and any of the other churches or mosques or synagogues or temples that are listening in, and community centers too. One, I think we learned from what the young brother Franklin, John W., was talking about in relation to his father in terms of going to where the people are. And I think we can learn much from Carter G. Woodson in this regard. We got to keep in mind Carter G. Woodson, who was actually the also PhD from Harvard, 1912, and the great John Hope Franklin, 95. And Carter G. Woodson only spent 1 year at Howard University, 1 year at West Virginia. Every other year, he was outside of the academy. He was there in the community. So when he talked about Black history, and one of the reasons why he's viewed as the godfather and the father of Black history, because he went there in the high schools, kindergarten, churches, community centers, and so forth. That's, you see John Hope Franklin at the highest levels of Harvard, University of Chicago, Duke, and so forth. His humility, his sense of service, he goes where the people are, prisons and so forth. So we can't rely simply on the curriculums. We got to fight for the curriculum. This is why I just recently signed a petition supporting my dear sister Nicole Hannah Jones with her 1619 project. We got to lift all of our voices. We got to make sure that those concerned about people who are suffering, that their analysis, their visions are part of the conversations. I don't believe any one interpretation of any history is a definitive truth. We need variety of voices because we all are partial and we're all fallen and cracked vessels in that regard. But we've got to create alternative sites. I mean, I thank God that when I was growing up, it wasn't just the curriculum at school. No, not at all. That Mom, Irene B. West, was reading us Langston Hughes, who she had met. She was reading us Sterling Brown and Gwendolyn Brooks at home. And when she taught in Vacation Bible School the whole summer, I always say this for a lot of my middle-class brothers and sisters who can't wait to go on vacation to Martha's Vineyard and spend 3 months and don't have time for a little service. No, Mom would spend a whole 6 weeks for 2 sessions, 6 weeks and 6 weeks doing what? Teaching the brothers and sisters right there in the hood. And we had open sessions at Shiloh Baptist. You didn't have to be a member of the church to come in because we had some good food too. But you're reading about their history. It didn't have to depend on schools. Didn't have to depend on what the mainstream was doing. We got our own care and concern networks to make sure our young people can cultivate their understanding of who they are and what role they have played in the shaping of the modern world and how the modern world has shaped them. So these are responsibilities for families, for churches, for civic institutions, as well as our schools and our curriculums and so forth. So we have to fight on all of those fronts, my dear brother, it seems to me, because when you're talking about truth, you know, truth is a dangerous thing. And truth uncompromisingly spoken always has ragged edges. That's what one of the great truth tellers of American culture named Herman Melville used to say over and over again, who spent a whole lot of time on the chocolate side of town in Albany. And one of the reasons why in the early parts of Moby Dick, that great novel of 1851, he first goes to a black church and hears that sermon, The Blackness of Blackness, before he gets on the boat to Pequod. What is Melville saying? Well, we don't have time to get into that right now, but he understands if you want to have a deep concern about truth and deep love, you're going to have to spend some time among a folk who have been hated, but taught the world much and something at a minimum about love and truth. Melville understood that. Mark Twain understood that in using black language in Huck Finn. That wasn't narrow cultural appropriation. It was an understanding of there was some truth and beauty there that was being overlooked, and I'm a great artist, and I'm gonna go get it. That's why Dvorak, when he comes to America as a European classical trained figure, where does he go? He goes to the Negro melodies. He goes to the Negro music. He's going for truth. He's going for beauty. He's heard Roland Hayes. He's heard the spirituals, both the Jubilee version from Fisk, where my mother met my father, or Baptist Church that you hear in the great artists like Tremaine Hawkins and Walter Hawkins and James Cleveland, geniuses, but also gut bucket. Yes, that's what we are, a people with sophistication and gut bucketness all tied together, funky as well as delicate as a rose, like the voice of a David Ruffin or a Ted Mills of Blue Magic or Russell Tompkins Jr. of the stylistics, and we ain't even got the Phyllis Hyman yet. Oh, what a people. If we understand access to, no matter what the curriculum say. See the point I'm making, my brother? Oh, he might not have the microphone anymore. Okay.
My father always believed we needed Saturday schools to make
Ooh,
sure.
I like that.
To make sure
like
that
that.
we add to whatever's in the curriculum so that we make sure that our children know more. Do we have other questions, either online or in the audience?
We have a question here in Tulsa.
Dr. West, thank you very much for what you've shared tonight. 45 years after Greenwood began to rebuild, the city of Tulsa brought their bulldozers in again to destroy it a second time, this time in the name of urban renewal and the war on. And I wonder if you could speak to what we need to reckon with as a society about the damage done in the name of renewal and rebuilding.
Absolutely, my brother. No, I appreciate that question because when we've had waves of gentrification on massive scales, that's in part what imperial expansion is all about. What Texas used to be Mexico, California used to be Mexico, and the vicious, unjust Mexican war takes place, and lo and behold, half of Mexico's gone. You see, that's land grabbing, that's power grabbing, that's the worst of the history of our species. And on a micro level within the country itself, we've got forms of gentrification or urban renewal where you have the interests of real estate brokers, the interests of corporate elites, the interests of the wealthy to reshape the city in such a way that the main benefits flow toward them, and working and poor people are treated as if they are afterthoughts. And there's waves of this. Each generation comes up with its new sets of strategies of these cycles of this greed and this cycles of contempt and so forth. And so I do hear you. We have to be voices. And this is one of the reasons why it's so very important to cast it at a moral and spiritual level in terms of the grounds, and then a strong analysis of the operations of power and domination that result in a multiracial coming together. Because anytime you cast it as an issue of integrity, honesty, and decency, you're going to find some folk with integrity, honesty, and decency and courage in every community, no matter how small they are. Just like you're going to find folk who are driven by cowardliness and greed and it is. So that the issues of class become very important. Issues of corporate greed become very important. This is why Bernie Sanders' campaign was so significant and why it was so disappointing in terms of its inability to convince enough Black leaders that they needed to opt for Medicare for all rather than opting for the pharmaceutical money that too often dictates their refusal to move in that direction. And we won't even mention the number of Black politicians who are the high beneficiaries of that big pharmaceutical money that they opt for rather than programs that would actually include everybody, not just reducing it, but including everybody in that way. And that's just one small example. The issues of class become very important, but always within the context of what Martin King and Dorothy Day and Rabbi Heschel and the others policy in the Middle East. Our Palestinian brothers and sisters are as precious as Israeli brothers and sisters. We must have a view in which humanity is at the center. And that's a moral and a spiritual issue. It's not tribal. It's not narrowly tied to what color people are or what their religions are and so forth and so on. Brother Martin used to say, I would fight as tenaciously against a Black supremacist civilization as I would a white supremacist civilization. He's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. And if folk in Tibet are being occupied, if folk in Kashmir are being occupied, if folk in Sub-Sahara being occupied, if folk in the West Bank are being occupied, occupations are immoral. They're illegal under international law. How do we raise our voices in such a way that we sustain the moral and spiritual quality of the analysis and don't fall into the vicious kinds of hatred that has become so fearful given the escalation of Jewish hatred? Well, Jewish hatred is sick, it's pathological, and so forth and so on. There's no doubt about it. We got to fight against it with every fiber of our being. But so it is with hatred of anybody. Hatred of Palestinians must be fought just as intensely. The hatred of Black folk fought just as intensely. The hatred of white folk. We hate white supremacy, not white folk. We hate the sin and try to stand in humanity with the sinner. That's what I learned in Antioch Baptist Church. That's called charitable Christian hatred. Hate the sin and love the sinner. Well, we need that these days. If there's going to be any serious talk about reconciliation tied to justice and love, we're going to have to learn how to civilization across the board, as if there's been no one in Western civilization critical of the Western crimes. Have we read Shakespeare? Have we read Dante? Have we read Diderot? Have we read so many Western figures who are critical of the Western crimes? The West has something to say, but the West has a whole lot to account for, given the crimes and brutalities against indigenous peoples and black peoples and brown peoples and women and gay brothers and lesbian sisters. But it doesn't mean you're throwing babies out with the bathwater in terms of the West being some monolithic X. The same would be true with Africa. You know, Africa's got its crimes, of course. You got great, magnificent African brothers and sisters. You got African gangsters too. You can't, if you can't make that distinction, then I don't think we're ready to build on the legacy of the great John Hope Franklin, because he made that distinction. Am I right, Brother John W.?
You are, you are. Do we have one last question before we close it out?
We have a question in Tulsa.
Hi, thank you. This has been a great symposium. I wanted to ask Cornel West, I mean, shouldn't we be connecting? I think one thing that's disturbing, you mentioned the military budget and that we spend 53 cents on the dollar. And you have these, liberal politicians, Biden, Harris, and many like them, who seem pretty progressive on race issues, but yet they're escalating this rhetoric against China, against Russia. They're promoting very aggressive foreign policies that are going to suck all our money and are going to screw over the black people who, as well as all of us, it's taking our money from public schools. I mean, here in Oklahoma, we have a terrible situation with the public school system. We had protests 2 years ago. The legislature was quiet. They didn't even respond. The teachers are paid abysmally low. The public schools are overcrowded. So anyways, my question is if you can just comment, I mean, and shouldn't, all of us here are progressives, and what can we do to push liberals, and to connect the foreign policy crimes and the neglect for working people?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, though, brother. No, I think, it's a matter of moral consistency. It's a matter of trying to hold on to your ethical integrity. And you can't, you can't on the one hand, as LBJ tried to do, say that I'm committed to, civil rights of black people in the 60s, and you're dropping these bombs on innocent brothers and sisters in Vietnam. And you end up soaking so much of the resources. Brother Martin used to say, what? Those bombs dropped in Vietnam fall in the black ghettos of the country. Brother Martin knew exactly what he was talking about. He's absolutely right. And it's not just monetary, but it's ethical and it's spiritual. It sucks up the soul of a nation. It becomes habitual. You become simply a gunfighter nation, thinking that somehow you can morally regenerate yourself through violence. Now, violence is, in fact, sometimes necessary. I'm not a pacifist like Martin Luther King Jr. See, I would have fought against a gangster named Hitler. I would have fought in the Jim Crow army against Hitler because he's trying to dominate the world. I would have joined Nelson Mandela in South Africa against the American apartheid neo-authoritarian regime. So I'm not a pacifist. He said, no. Self-defense. Deacons for self-defense coming out of Louisiana. I understand they got their Bibles and they got their willingness to resist. We saw that in Tulsa, right? Those brothers who came back from World War I and these folk, the white brothers and sisters coming in with guns to kill them and their wives and their kids, they said no. In that first encounter, what was it though, Brother John? It was 10 white brothers and sisters that got shot. It was 2 black folk who got shot initially. Why? Because the love that they had for their families led towards self-defense. I believe in that. But at the same time, though, the larger point is, and LBJ was white supremacists from Jim Crow, Texas, who ended up a major force for good, fighting against white supremacy in the domestic context. But in the global context, he becomes a defender. So if Biden is LBJ on the domestic front, and I'm with him on his domestic front, and I'm glad to see him making moves toward trying to expand relief bills and infrastructures in a broad way against the narrow conceptions of the Republican Party. But if he also gets locked into a militarism abroad, then we're going to get an LBJ cycle reenacted in the 21st century. And we've seen how deadly that cycle can be, just for the nation in terms of its spiritual decay, as well as for the economy in terms of sucking the resources in a militaristic manner rather than a civic manner, really investing in people and investing in their skills and what have you. But we shall see. I mean, Biden is still relatively new. We're going to give him some time, but we have to be honest about it too now. Oh, yes, indeed, indeed, indeed. We got to be honest about the brother. And his record, of course, has not been that encouraging. Mass incarceration, invasion and occupation of Iraq, and unleashing Wall Street greed with the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and a number of supports of what's going on in Haiti right now with black dictatorial rule and the refusal to really want to thoroughly side with the people at the moment. I mean, those are not good signs. But he can change. He can change. We shall see. We shall keep the pressure on. That's the crucial thing. We shall keep the pressure on. But we just want to be consistent. We want to be honest across the board. Let's just put it that way. We want to be honest across the board. Very much so.
Well, Brother Cornel, I want to thank you for a wonderful session tonight. And audience, please join me in thanking Cornel for spending time with us and sharing his vision and perspective on our society. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother. Salute the Franklin legacy.
Thank you. Salute the West as well.
No,
thank you. Thank you and good night. I hope that you will join us tomorrow morning at 9:20 for the next symposium. I'm doing next part of the symposium. I'm doing a session tomorrow afternoon on how the Yiddish press covered Tulsa that week, June 2nd, 1921, and described Tulsa as a pogrom. Use the same language to describe what happened May 31st and June 1st as what was happening across Europe at that time. So, Brother West, thank you. I look forward to our paths crossing again soon.
It's always a joy and a blessing, my brother.
Definitely.
Take care now.
Good night, everyone.
So we have a few more to us tonight. So this can follow up to what we have heard from Cornel West. What we want to do at this point is think about how this affects us. So we want to talk to one another. We want to have that opportunity. So I'm going to ask you, you should have some sheets that you receive that have questions on them. And we're going to use those for a bit of conversation. And so I want to just give a brief statement about why the conversation matters. So we spend a lot of time needing to hear what is reconciliation, what is repairing the wrong happened to others, and working toward making a difference. And so what gives us a framework, gives us a background to think about and say, what can I do? What's my role based on what I just heard? We don't want you to walk out of here tonight and not connect with one thing, at least one thing that you can do. So our goal in the conversation as you're looking at those questions, so there's a question that you have that you'll see something say opening, and then guided questions, and then And what we're going to do, I'm going to ask you to get into groups of around 4 people, and preferably not the same 4 people who you talk to all the time, but obviously try to just dig deep into the question. Give you about 5 minutes to talk with one another, share, make sure everyone has an opportunity to say something that they connect with, and choose any of the questions that you want. I also encourage you to, when you have a little more time, if there's really something that stood out to you, I encourage you to just talk to each other about something that stood out to you and what you heard, with our goal at the end being, I need to choose one thing that I heard tonight where I know I can make a difference in the work of reconciling men and women unto each other. So what can we do? So I'm just going to give you space to find 4 people. So when you can, I'm going to give you, we're going to move to another section, and you're going to have about 7 to 10 minutes in that section. I'm going to ask you to focus on this question. Actually not on the sheet, so I'm making it up for you. When you think about where you are, your experiences, whatever it is, what keeps you up at night for what concerns you based on thinking about what's on in society? What are the things that are keeping you up at night, being concerned about how we're going to fix them? What's keeping you up at night? So talk to each other about that. So I want to take a moment to see does someone want to share something that's happened in your group? Anyone want to put something out there for the whole room, possibly? Opportunity? Anyone want to say something to the whole room about what you've been discussing so far? Anyone feel compelled? I heard that. Okay, so let's actually move to the last category here, and I'm going to give you an opportunity. I want you to look at, there are 4 questions there. And I really want, this is the point of why we're here tonight. We want you to have a commitment to something that you can do differently, that you can commit to. Now, he made a statement, so there was a statement that he made. A life that does not have, a life that's not committed to something is not worth living. So the question, so am I the only one? Did anyone else hear that tonight? I could be making it up. But think about that. If commitment matters, if you don't know what you're committed to, other people think they can tell you to go any direction. And you don't know which direction your life is going because you're not intentional. So I want us to be a little more intentional tonight about where we want to commit to getting there. Just what's an action today? We don't have to turn around and be 100% perfect in getting to where we want to be, like we'll get there tomorrow, but we should certainly have a pathway. So talk to each other and just I'm not choosing the question. You all choose in your group what you want to respond to that relates to commitment. So I'm just going to be quiet and let you talk. going to ask us to wrap up in the next minute, please. So I'm hoping we're at a stopping point, and let me frame it as we're just pausing for right now. You've had a conversation with a few people, but what I'm asking you to do is continue the conversation, continue the work, remember what your commitment was, and do it. Share it with people as far as I'm making progress in this area. Find some partners who are interested in the same type of progress that you want to make. Don't do it alone, because we know that the partnership, the collaboration is part of the work. You know, we hear, you know, we're in a church, fortunately, so we can, where we talk about the 2 or 3 are gathered together, then God is there. So we know, and it's the cord is stronger when 2 or 3 people are gathered together. It can't be broken as easily. So remember, you want to get to your commitment by being stronger together. And so that's the kind of work that we want you to think about when we get together. And so hopefully you've been able to do that. So I have one thing that I need from you. So just pretend like this is my job. And if you don't give me an evaluation, they're going to fire me. So you have a survey, and if you would please fill it out for me, and it will be how I get to determine if I get to keep my job. So if you just leave the survey, and actually, you know, I want to do something. I think we should. I know most of you here, so we'll do that. I think I want to do just a really short prayer, mainly because we saw the Pastor Emeritus where he left. He wanted to go take care of his wife. I just want to do a short prayer. Okay. Dear Father, we just come to you today, and we just thank you, for being one who takes care of all needs, all concerns. And we know that this church is always concerned about each member. We're concerned on Pastor Emeritus and his wife, May Helen Potter. We don't know what's going on, and we don't need to know, but what we do need to know is that you are in charge of everything. And just put your hand of protection around her and love on her and get her to feeling well. We thank you in advance because we know you are the one who can heal. You are the one who can make the soul better, the body better. Jesus Christ, we thank you now and forever. Amen.